Hello again. This is the second lecture in your introduction to pathophysiology from a psychophysiological perspective. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about hormones and clinically high levels of impulsive behavior. Impulsive behavior and the dopamine pathway. Impulsive behavior is a common problem seen by behavioral therapists, and it is very difficult to demonstrate treatment efficacy when the criteria include follow-up several years long. Brain scans have recently demonstrated a common biological basis to many types of abnormal impulsiveness, from binge shopping addiction to serial dating, including rash decision making. The extent to which the biological basis is expressed is, of course, altered by the environment, upbringing, social conditions, and etc. Impulsivity has long been linked to the neurotransmitter dopamine. Recent studies have demonstrated that abnormalities in dopamine producing and receiving systems underlie impulsiveness. According to a study published recently in Science, Joshua Buchholz and his team determined that very impulsive people have less active dopamine receptors in their midbrains than less impulsive matched controls. Thus, they don't get the normal amount of stimulation and reinforcement for considering options. The team also found that the impulsive people produce a huge wave of dopamine when stimulated by impulse-related stimuli. This resulted in massive stimulation of the midbrain's decision area and thus to snap decisions without time for consideration of the consequences. For more information, see the file named Impulsiveness and Dopamine. Hormones and incredibly poor decision making. The problems I've discussed on the last slide lead to compulsive shopping behaviors, risk-taking, which leads to problems such as speeding, sometimes violence, and criminal behaviors such as robbery. All this happens because people are just trying to get a normal amount of stimulation. Are you treating someone with these behavioral problems? If so, have you had hormone function adequately checked? If not, well, now I'm going to spend a few minutes very specifically talking about hormones and violent behavior that are associated with hormonal imbalances leading to criminal behavior. This is a rapidly growing area of research. You may want to read the book, The Psychopathology of Crime, Criminal Behavior as a Clinical Disorder. This is also one of those areas where previously accepted studies are now damned without new data contradicting the original studies and without significant critiques of the original experimental designs. Here's a little cartoon talking about what happens when steroids creep into some competitions. Another cartoon illustrating the mythology of the problems. They took away my science fair award today. They said I ate too much fish, which is brain food, so it was like I was on mental steroids. Nelson reviews the data on the increasing use of steroids by both men and boys. The huge longitudinal Youth Risk Behavior Survey shows that about 6% of 9th to 12th graders regularly use steroids. The key is that anabolic steroid abuse frequently results in lowered thresholds for violent behavior. They also lead to bizarre, erratic, and hostile behavior. These behaviors are especially problematic as the users have become unusually strong. Having a normally rational, socially acceptable friend act in such ways can be very unnerving. Dealing with such people can be quite intimidating. I emphasize that chronic steroid use lowers the threshold for releasing abnormal behaviors, especially violence, even including murder. Nelson reports only one placebo-controlled study of brief 3-day use of testosterone in 20 healthy non-users. They acted as their own controls in a crossover design. The most common positive changes in mood were euphoria, increased energy, and increased sexual arousal. The most common negative changes were irritability, mood swings, feelings of violence, hostility, distractibility, confusion, and impaired memory. Hormones and aggression. The following generalizations used to be well accepted, then were played down, and now they're in vogue again. In general, men are more likely to be violently aggressive than women. Men are far more likely than women to commit violent crime. The male hormone testosterone is clearly related to aggression in all primate species involving humans. Not only does more testosterone result in more aggression, successful aggression, such as winning a fight, results in more testosterone. Again, these are generalizations which frequently don't hold up. This is just what you hear on the street. It's very likely that higher testosterone levels increase a man or woman's status in any hierarchy, including business. For hierarchies where status is maintained through violence, then the men and women are proportionately more violent. This relationship between testosterone levels and both status and violence has been specifically confirmed for female human inmates. Several longitudinal studies indicate that levels of testosterone change before changes in violent behavior and status. Please read this slide to yourself. Please read this slide to yourself. Please read this slide to yourself. So, how does testosterone impact violent behavior? It's believed that high levels of hormones, testosterone in particular, are necessary though not sufficient to trigger aggressive behavior. According to some studies, there's a critical period shortly after birth when testosterone sensitizes certain neural pathways in the brain, and when these circuits are stimulated again by steroids in adulthood, aggressive behavior is elicited. Experimental data show that when testosterone acts on synapses, it lowers the amount of 5-HT available for synaptic transmission. This is significant because the presence of 5-HT serves to inhibit aggression. A viewpoint that I mentioned earlier in the course is that testosterone may be an inducer, not a cause of the behaviors. There's considerable support for testosterone being related to status. So here's an article in Scientific American from 2007. Strange but true, testosterone alone does not cause violence. Hormones don't necessarily make men violent, but they do cause them to seek social dominance. Hormones, stress, and aggression. a vicious cycle. Rat research shows a feedback loop between stress hormones and the brain's attack center. New research may help explain why, under stress, we're quick to lash out and slow to cool down. The authors comment that their findings could explain why, in a conflict, the glandular release of stress hormones may effectively cancel out the effect of therapies meant to curb bad behavior, especially lashing out. If you work with people in anger violence control, you should read the above article and the many follow-up articles, as it may lead you to review your therapeutic strategies. Hormones and criminal behavior. There is increasing evidence that neurochemical factors play a role in aggressive behavior in humans. Genetic differences may also cause violence in both human and non-human species. A few reviews include criminal behavior and mental health and understanding and preventing violence. Notice that these are from 1994. There have been numerous studies performed and reviews written afterwards. I'm just providing these so that you can find them and then go ahead and look at what's come later. Well, getting away from violence and on to some of the more odd behaviors, I'll talk now about hormones and schizophrenia. There has been considerable speculation that schizophrenia is caused by abnormal patterns of response to reproductive hormones. The following are a couple of nice reviews on this. Here are some recent findings. Epidemiological and life cycle data point to significant differences in the incidence and course of schizophrenia between men and women, suggesting a protective role of estrogen. In vitro and in vivo preclinical research has confirmed estradiols' interactions with central neurotransmitter systems implicated in the pathogenesis of schizophrenia, whereas results from randomized controlled trials investigating the antipsychotic potential of estrogen have been promising. Research into other neuroactive hormones with positive effects on mental state is a field still in its infancy, but is evolving rapidly. I mentioned this earlier in the course. I just want to repeat, though, that hormonal responses to stress affect the brain's function and structure. Prolonged stress responses do affect both the brain's function and structure. Several parts of the brain shrink due to prolonged stress responses. Other parts of the brain get caught in a vicious cycle where you have a positive feedback loop of habit formations which lead to inappropriate responses to environmental stimuli, which in turn cause even more stress responses. Bipolar disorder. Many people diagnosed with bipolar disorder certainly do exhibit the symptoms, but actually do not have the disorder. Rather, they have hormonal dysregulation syndromes. So, if you're working with someone exhibiting the symptoms of bipolar disorder, you need to have their hormones checked. Next, I'm going to discuss a very few of the hormone-based clinical issues in puberty. This is a discussion of when hormones go wrong, not the usual nightmares about when hormonal changes happen the way they are expected to happen. Hormonal causes of abnormal adolescent behavior. Puberty and adolescence are bad enough, but when hormones go wrong on top of it, especially when therapist gets dragged into the puberty conflict. Sexual awareness too young? It turns out that if young girls are exposed to estrogen when they're even 8 or 9 years old, then they will become sexually mature to the extent of growing breast tissue and having very strong sexual feelings. The first proof of this was over 30 years ago when a chicken processing plant in Puerto Rico gave their chickens too much estrogen, and those chickens were served to lots of school children, and vast numbers of very young girls became sexually active at 8 or 9. We have to consider the need for risk-taking to feel comfortable levels of sensations. As I've talked about before, these are very definitely linked with hormones. Of course, therapists get dragged in when there are parent-child conflicts around sex and risk-taking. On top of all that, there's impaired decision-making, which can go terribly, terribly wrong. Next, I'm going to say a few words about neurotransmitter problems. Next, I'm going to spend a few minutes discussing the link between suicide and hormones. Are you counseling significant others of somebody who unexpectedly committed suicide? Are you part of a forensic team evaluating the cause of the suicide? Are you involved in trying to prevent a suicide? Or do you just want to know more about how suicides happen? In any of these cases, you need to know about the link between hormones, neurotransmitters, and apparently unanticipated suicides.
Why it's important for you to study human biology. Example 1. Think about what you've learned about why people commit suicide when they do. Did you learn that about 90% of people who commit suicide apparently have mental illnesses that nobody noticed because nobody can figure out why they committed suicide right when they did? The fact is that for about 9 out of 10 people who commit suicide, there is no obvious predisposing factor which would cause them to kill themselves just at that point in time. There's no extra stress, problems, etc. that are really happening at that moment which are all that bad, that the rest of us don't deal with. However, you can always find something. The trouble is you can find the same situations and intensities for people who do not kill themselves. When forensic and clinical psychologists do a suicide psychological autopsy, they usually don't come up with anything specific which would push someone over the edge just then. Surviving friends, relatives, and significant others sometimes spend years with huge guilt burdens because they feel that there should be something that they could have done to prevent the suicide. The usual pattern is if they could have just noticed, not been critical that day, just not have said that, just been more supportive. Unfortunately, actually pinning down just what did push each individual over the edge is not possible most of the time. Even suicide notes don't help much. We do know that people who actually set out to successfully commit suicide reach a point of great depression at the time they reach a point of great impulsiveness. This does not include people who make an attempt likely to fail, which is a call for help. The two factors taken together, impulsiveness and Great Depression, frequently result in suicide. Now the question is why two behaviors which normally change independently come together in a potentially disastrous way. Carol Ezell reviewed the evidence for physiological changes in the brain which result in this horrid combination of behaviors occurring together. She found numerous studies that show, 1, that a tiny spot near the bottom of the prefrontal cortex, just a few cubic millimeters in size, contains an area which is highly involved in control of the perceived intensity of both depression and impulsivity. Second, she found that the nerve cells in that tiny spot communicate with each other by using the neurotransmitter serotonin. The nerves have specially shaped receptors on their surfaces, which receive serotonin released by other nerve cells. These nerve cells do not make the serotonin themselves. Serotonin is made in the base of the brain and transported through tubes into this tiny part of the cortex. When insufficient serotonin reaches this area, the cells grow more receptors for serotonin. Comparisons of the brains of similar people who did and did not commit suicide shows that the nerve cells in this single tiny part of the brain in suicide victims did not receive sufficient serotonin to communicate with each other because they've grown huge numbers of extra receptors for serotonin. Thus, the cells are working. They just aren't getting enough serotonin to communicate with each other and the rest of the brain. Thus, the problem is not with the nerve cells themselves, but with the serotonin transport system. The tubes break down for some unknown reason, and the timing can be catastrophic. When insufficient serotonin reaches this area, perceived intensity of both depression and impulsivity go up. So people are very likely to feel like killing themselves and are very impulsive, so may go ahead and do it. Thus, many suicides may take place for a purely physiological reason. Think about what that means for psychological preventive treatment.
Low levels of oxytocin or genetic insensitivity to it can lead to abnormal social behaviors. Oxytocin apparently has effects which go far beyond its birth and lactation roles. Numerous studies show that it helps lubricate our every pro-social exchange, the thousands of acts of kindness that make human society possible. Research in humans suggests that oxytocin underlines the twin emotional pillars of civilized life, our capacity to feel empathy and trust. Researchers found that genetic differences in people's responsiveness to the effects of oxytocin were linked to their ability to read faces, infer the emotions of others, feel distress at others' hardship, and even to identify with characters in a novel or the cartoon Doonesbury. Conclusions. Lots of behavioral problems are partially or entirely caused by physiological problems we can detect and frequently correct. Your diagnosis frequently needs to be based on more than a cluster of symptoms, as many different underlying physiological and behavioral problems lead to the same cluster. This means you frequently can't use DSM-5 diagnostic criteria alone for determining either diagnosis or progress through an intervention. Ignoring the first 2 points means that you could easily provide an ineffective treatment. You may even contribute to great harm. That's it, folks. If you want copies of the slides or have questions, just let me know. rsherman@saybrook.edu. Goodbye for now.